So what we had seen up until this point, we were looking at the ways that music was actually produced, and what we saw was how expensive it is. So, for example, we saw that in order to actually make, say, 10 copies of a song, you might actually have to perform the song 10 times, right, to make these individual copies that would be sold on these wax cylinders. We also saw that there was some advancement in these cylinders where you could, in essence, have some reverse stamping on a metal stamp, and then from here you could get approximately 2,500 copies from each master. All right. So that, in essence, what you could do is, rather than having the 10 little machines, so, you know, for example, we drew our guy here with our little guitar, you know, and rather than having a machine here, you know, having, say, 10 of these machines and only getting 10 copies. You could have 10 of these machines. Well, if each one of these makes 2,500, these 10 machines now can give us, in essence, 25,000 copies of the song, right? Still, I mean, a huge improvement, but still really, 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 really expensive, all right? So what we saw was that even by the 1890s, and this stuff had been around for already a while by now, we saw that we had, like we said, 1892, we had 320 minutes of recorded music total. By 1894, this had gone up to, 1,000 minutes. Right? Stuff's incredibly expensive. Now, between 1919 and 1922, we saw this explosion of new firms that are producing record players and basically records. Okay. So in 1909, for example, you had 18 different firms in this industry. By 1919, this had increased to 166 firms. So almost essentially a tenfold increase in the number of firms that are within the industry. All right. When you have lots of firms in an industry, what happens to price? Goes down, right? So one way to say, hey, to essentially get price back up is to try to make the number of firms smaller, right? So we saw around 1925, number of firms began to decline again. Because we have a lot of these mergers. Right. Firms are getting swallowed up by other firms, et cetera. From the 1930s to 1945, the industry is essentially dormant. For two obvious reasons. The ones in the 30s being the Great Depression. People don't have any money. People can't even afford food. They're not going to be able to afford music. 1940s, you've got World War II. There's a shortage of shellac to actually make the records themselves. Okay. During this time, though, of course, you've continued to see other innovations. So you've got now magnetic tape recorders. Okay. So this pre-tape technology, right, so this is all of this crap right here that you're dealing with. This pre-tape technology was limited in a couple of different ways. It was expensive. To purchase, and it's unforgiving. On mistakes. So remember, we said, I mean, if you want to be able to make these 25,000 copies, you have to have 10 of these machines. The person has to do the song, and you want another 25,000 copies, they're going to have to do the song again. If you make a mistake, you've got to throw out the stamps. The reverse stamping master has to be thrown out, right? Every single time you make a mistake, going all the way back to even earlier when it's just each wax cylinder is individually made. If you make a mistake, that cylinder is no good. You have to throw the whole thing out. With magnetic tape, we can essentially cut the mistakes out. And it becomes a whole lot cheaper to produce, all right, new music. So these things are an innovation. In technology, right? They're greatly reducing the cost of production. Right? They are forgiving on the mistakes, etc. Right? So what you see here is for a few $1,000s. That's about how much these cost. One can buy a magnetic tape recorder. And enter the industry. Since it's relatively easy to enter the industry, the cost is basically the magnetic tape recorder, a few $1,000s in a room, right? That you get some padding on the wall so that the sound's not bouncing off and stuff. I mean, you guys have seen recording studios. You kind of have an idea in your mind of what they look like. I mean, they're not that complicated to build, right? They're pretty easy to enter the industry. So what do we see happening here to the number of firms? Firms goes up, right? So we saw way back over here, the patents kept firms out. We had changes in technology, patents expired, firms come in. We see lots of mergers. Hey, this stinks, prices are going down. We don't want that, we want prices to go up. Have lots of mergers, the number of firms goes down. Change in technology reduces cost, firms come in. Okay. So we have this new wave of entry. In 1956, small firms are 52% of market share. By 1962, just a few years later, there's 75% of market share. All right, so the big firms have gone from controlling 48% of the market back down to 25% of the market. So, what are the major firms going to do? Lots of firms coming in means music is getting what? Cheaper. We don't want that. We want prices high. What are we going to do? Buy them up. Same thing that we did over here. We got these waves of mergers. Got the 80s. We've got CD technology. All right. You have today digital technology. These guys are changing different costs, right? Because let's remember, when we're discussing music and its costs, we've got essentially production cost and we have distribution cost. Magnetic tape technologies and CD technologies are changing production costs. They're making production costs go down. But you still have to distribute a physical CD or a physical cassette tape or a physical 8-track tape. Right? The distribution costs aren't changing. Production costs are coming down, but distribution costs are not. How many of you guys have had urban and regional economics? So we talk about these distribution costs, these transportation costs significantly. So if we have a firm, if this is area, all right, this is distance in miles. So here's our factory. We have a production cost for our factory of making anything. And we'll just say songs since we're dealing with songs here. Let's assume it costs $5 to make it. So we have this height here. Here's our factory at this mile. It's at 0 miles. These distribution costs are essentially transportation costs, right? And these transportation costs are a function of how far you're shipping the stuff and how much it costs to ship it per mile, right? So when we're having transportation costs, these guys kind of look like this, right? So in essence, here are our transportation costs. So we have production costs, and you have transportation costs. Okay. And what we want to know is, we want to know, for example, like, well, so here's, so here you are, I'm making up a number here, 50 miles away. There's some amount of production cost, and there's some amount of transportation cost. I'm going to make the transportation cost be $2, right? So at this point right here, this is 2. So we see here that the cost to sell this cassette tape or whatever is $7. What we're seeing here is we're seeing changes in these guys, but we're not seeing changes in these guys, right? And let me illustrate the problem of these transportation costs in another completely different format, and that's McDonald's. So when you look at a map, of a town, typically you'll see a McDonald's here, 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 something like that, right? Why don't you have all the McDonald's located here? Did you ever think about that? Why are all the McDonald's not right next to each other? And it has to do with this market area, right? Because here the transportation costs are not the firm's, it's the consumer's cost to go to the store. So if I'm a consumer and these are all selling the exact same product, I'm going to go to the one that, typically speaking, has the lowest transportation costs for me, the lowest cost in terms of gas and time to get there. So if I live here, I'm going to go and visit this guy. If I live here, I'm going to go and visit this guy, right? And this is actually what's called the principle of median location. It kind of tells you that the firms are going to locate in the median of their consumer base. So that if this McDonald's, if this town only has one McDonald's and people are fairly equally distributed throughout the town, where are they going to locate? Right in the center, right? They're not going to locate here. That doesn't make any sense. Because these consumers up here will have a really high cost getting there. These consumers here would have a really low cost, right? So I'm going to kind of locate in the middle of my market. And in essence, what you can see, the reason that you can have all of these different McDonald's is that, to a degree, they have little bitty individual market areas, right? So this McDonald's, its market area is here. This McDonald's, its market area is here. This one's 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 here. And this one's here, because maybe this part up here is less less densely populated, right? And so you have these little bitty market areas that are a function of these production costs and these transportation costs. And so here's our consumer, our McDonald's consumer. And you have two different McDonald's that you can go to. (2,500 feet), right? And here's the other McDonald's. This McDonald's is over here. So here's McDonald's A, here's McDonald's B. And they also have the same production cost. And they also have these same transportation costs, right? And here's over here is McDonald's C. Same production cost, same transportation cost. All right. And so this firm's market area is this guy, right? This McDonald's market area is this guy. This McDonald's market area is this guy. It's the production and the distribution costs that are determining market area. The size of that market area determines the number of firms. So why are there lots of grocery stores, but there's not lots of Lowe's and Home Depots? Right? You got a Lowe's on the north side, you got a Lowe's on the south side, you got a Home Depot on the south side. That's it. How many grocery stores are in Springfield? More than 3, right? A lot. So the market area for the hardware stores is basically, there's enough demand for 3 stores. The grocery stores, there's enough demand for, I'm making up 20 stores, whatever the number is. I don't know what the number of grocery stores is. It's a function of how much consumers are purchasing these transportation costs and these production costs. Okay? So let's think about what's happening over here in music. We're seeing changes in technology that are changing production costs, but they're not necessarily changing transportation costs. So we have these mergers that are occurring, right? Because we have all of these firms coming in. Here we're seeing, hey, it's getting cheap to enter the industry. Production costs are declining. And when these production costs decline, all of these other things decline as well. So if the production costs decline to here, and the transportation costs stay the same, hey, the market area expands, right? And would you have these declines in price, you can have more consumers coming in so that maybe the market area actually even shrinks up, depending upon the differences between the elasticities in the change in production costs and the change in the number of consumers in terms of price, in terms of consumers' demand, right? So in short, what we have here is we're seeing changes in production costs, but not necessarily changes in distribution costs. Here, of course, we're seeing changes in both production and distribution costs, right? So we have some changes here. We have some expansions, but these expansions are limited by the distribution costs. Bless you. So if you're an independent record company and you want to distribute your stuff nationwide, you either have to A, create your own distribution network, or B, you can piggyback off one of the major firms. And of course, if you're piggybacking off one of the major firms, what are they going to do? They're going to charge you a lot for it. So what we started to see here, interestingly enough, we saw all of these changes in technology, changing the number of firms, till we kind of got to here. Here, once again, a new innovation, changing technology. Only this time, we didn't see a bunch of new firms coming in. The distribution costs are still relatively high. Totally a change in technology. It's completely changing production and distribution costs. We're still not seeing another bunch of new firms coming in. Why? I mean, that's the question that we're trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out all of these other changes in technology have led to all of these new firms coming in. Competition's good, except for these last two changes. We didn't really see a whole lot of new firms coming in. Right? I mean, how hard is it to make a song now? If you play the guitar, how hard is it to record that? Not very. You put your computer there, and you can get a copy that's almost as good as what you would have had 20, 30 years ago. And how cheaply can you distribute that? Free. Email it out to everybody you want to. It's free. There should be tons of new firms coming in, right? This room right here could be a production studio. All you need is a bunch of microphones and some computers and some rugs on the wall, and you're done. Have one kid right here write up a web page, sell it on the web page, you're done. The firm could consist of 2 people. That's it. But we don't see that. So let's look at the market structure of the industry, which hasn't changed much. Since the waves of mergers here. Essentially, you have 4 different large firms. Now, if you've had an industrial organization or you've had intermediate micro, you've talked about the measures of market concentration, right? You have several different measures of market concentration. One of them is like the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. You've got the 4-firm concentration ratio, the 8-firm concentration ratio. If you're looking at the 4-firm concentration ratio, what does that mean? Here's another one, the 8-firm one. Right? I mean, we're trying to determine how concentrated is an industry, right? You have several different ways. These are the 3 most used by economists. 4-firm concentration, 8-firm concentration, and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Right? Where the Herfindahl-Hirschman index says, let's take the market structure of everybody, we'll square it, add it all up. All right? So if you have 1 firm, well, they have a market concentration, they have a market ratio of a market share of 100%. 100% times 100% is 10,000. If you have 100 firms and they all have an equal share, 1% squared is 1, right? 1 squared is 1. Add all that up, it's 100. So you know that on this Herfindahl-Hirschman index, this guy goes from 0 up to 10,000, right? The higher you get, the more concentrated the industry is. What are these guys? What do you think they are?
Share of one firm to the other.
Yeah, the share of the top 4 firms, the shares of the top 8 firms, right? So we have a 4-firm concentration ratio. So if this guy is, say, 40%, this means we take all the firms, we line them all up. Let's look at the 4 largest firms. We'll add up their market share, 40%. Oh, the top 4 largest firms control 40% of the market. All of the other firms control 60%. 8-firm concentration ratio. So if this guy right here is like, say, I mean, it could be anything. It could be any number that you want it to be. 50%. The top 8 firms control 50% of the market, right? All of the other firms, however many number of firms that is, controls 50% of the market, right? So these guys can tell us all kinds of different things too. And actually what we can do is we can look at these 2 guys together and you you can, when we're not going to for music. But I mean, if this guy right here, if the 4-firm concentration ratio is like, say, 40, and this guy, I'm just making up a number here, is 41, this guy tells you right here, hey, these 4 firms are roughly 40%, so we'll just take the average, we'll say they're each 10%. Take the next 4 largest firms, you only get 1% more. You got 4 really large firms, you got a whole bunch of little bitty tiny firms, right? Is essentially what that guy says. So when we're looking at our market structure here for the music industry, we have an industry that is relatively concentrated. Right? We have a 4-firm concentration ratio here of about 85% market share. 85% of the industry is controlled by 4 firms. It's essentially an oligopoly, right? There are, technically speaking, hundreds and thousands of individual firms producing music. You can go into, I mean, you don't use the Yellow Pages anymore, and I don't either, but you do a Google search of production companies in Springfield or Branson or whatever. I mean, there are production studios in Branson and in Springfield recording music. Not a lot of them, but they're there. And if they're here in Springfield and Branson, then you know they're in Kansas City and St. Louis, Chicago, Vegas, all those other places, right? But they're really, 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 really small. These 4 large firms all started out as single labels. And in essence have acquired other labels. And they control distribution of physical copies and, more importantly, radio play. All right. So what you had here, I mean, like we said, we had these waves of mergers. And essentially, by the time we had gotten to this point, the 4 largest firms had gotten to the point where they can, in essence, control the distribution. And by being able to control distribution, it doesn't matter if you can make the music. If you can't get it in the store to sell it, you don't exist. So by controlling the distribution, they're able to, in essence, this time, they're able to keep out the other firms. So let's look at what these 4 firms are. Vivendi Universal, Sony BMG, Time Warner, EMI. When you hear the word universal, what do you think of? You think of music? You think of movies? And to a lesser degree, theme parks. When you hear the word Time Warner, what do you think of? Music? Yeah, you think of TV and movies. Same thing here for Sony. Sony owns a TV or a movie studio. EMI does not. Right. So all of these firms have this long lineage going all the way back to the early parts of the 20th century in terms of music. And each one of these firms, with the exception of EMI, is part of a larger media conglomerate. Right. So all of these guys are both vertically integrated in terms of production, distribution, and sales of music, in terms of manufacturing, production, distribution, retail, all of this. They control the whole thing. So Vivendi Universal here is a subsidiary of a larger French company. They are the largest company in terms of market share and recorded music. Their library has over 1 million titles. One out of every 4 CDs is a Vivendi Universal CD that's being sold. But that's not all that they have, right? They also have Universal Studios, which makes movies. USA Networks, Houghton Mifflin, which is publishing, book publishing. What else do we have? They've got A&M Records. These are just some of the bigger ones. Universal Motown. Polygram. Interscope. Decca. Def Jam Records. All of these individual record companies aren't actually individual record companies. They're all owned by one company. And here, of course, is where you can see the real genius, right? Universal Studios is Harry Potter, right? Is that right? Sell the book, put it on TV, make the movies, soundtracks, theme parks, all one package. Everything cross-selling to everything else. The movies are selling soundtracks, the soundtracks are selling the theme parks are selling the books are selling the movies are selling the retail merchandise. All one thing. Sony, BMG is a joint venture between Sony, obviously, and Bertelsmann. They also produce, manufacture, and distribute music, as almost all of these people do, right? We understand production is not the actual making of the CDs or whatever. That's having the artists come in and have them make the songs, right? Manufacture is stamping CDs or the tapes or whatever, etc. They purchased, of course, CBS Records. They own, of course, Columbia Pictures. TriStar Pictures, RCA Music. They've got Epic Records, RCA Nashville, Zomba Music Group, Rough Trade Records, Artist Death Records, etc. Time Warner, same thing. Production, Manufacture and distribution. They have obviously Warner Brothers Pictures. The WB network. HBO. Time Warner Cable. Time Life Magazine. Warner Books. Once again, everything cross-selling everything else. You ever wonder why there's articles in your news magazines about movies and stuff like that? It's not news. It's an advertisement. It just looks like news. Asylum Records. Atlantic. Elektra. Reprise. Sire. Warner Brothers Records. Those are just some of the more well-known labels, right? This is not all the labels that they own. EMI, same thing. Production, manufacture, and distribution. Right? This is a major British firm, basically. This is actually a British corporation. All right, so here we've got, say, Blue Note Records, Capitol, Mute Records, Virgin Records, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these 4 different companies controlling basically, like we said, about 85% of all the music that is sold. %, sold by everybody else. If you guys ever watch, like these shows on like biographies of like musicians and things like that, they're always talking about how hard it is to break into the industry. So for example, Creed, they went to their record company, they made their CDs, they couldn't get their CDs sold, so they would go around and have shows, and they would essentially give the CDs away from the back of their car, from the trunk of their car. They had a trunk full of CDs. They would give them away. They had no other way. They couldn't get a label to sign them. They eventually got signed by a tiny little independent label. They started to get famous. That's when the major labels started to take notice and say, okay, let's go ahead and buy them all up, right? I mean, all of the artists have this problem. All of the artists are here within this guy. It's hard to get into this guy. It's easy to get here, but these people don't sell anything. I can't get through the next topic in 5 minutes. So we'll stop here. We'll get out a little early today. We'll pick it up from physical distribution here and digital distribution on Friday.